A heart of stone. Officer Mark Riley sat rigidly in his patrol car, his expression a mask of silent tension as the rumble of the engine vibrated through the seat. He was parked on the edge of Lincoln Avenue, known for hosting occasional protests and marches, particularly in recent years. Today, a crowd was gathering, their banners bright against the cloudy afternoon sky, their voices carrying chants and calls for justice, reform, and accountability. For Riley, scenes like this had become a bitter routine. To him, these gatherings were nothing more than unnecessary disturbances, disruptions created by people who had little understanding of what it meant to truly serve and protect. Watching the crowd grow and swell with energy, his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the steering wheel, his gaze flinty and unyielding. The radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Riley, you need backup out there." He lifted the radio to his lips, his voice curt. "Negative. I've got this under control." As he watched the protesters, most of them younger than him and full of what he perceived as naive idealism, Riley felt his irritation harden into something more defiant. His fellow officers respected him, admired his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, and he prided himself on keeping the order, on not allowing the chaos he saw in these gatherings to spill over into his streets. Riley's gaze swept over the faces in the crowd, catching sight of people of all ages. There were teens in hoodies, college students with backpacks, a few older folks holding small signs in weathered hands, and then his eyes fell on a man, standing apart from the others, dressed in a tailored black suit, crisp and out of place among the homemade signs and casual attire. The man was silent, watching the protest unfold with a calm, calculating gaze. Riley narrowed his eyes, his instincts flaring. He didn't trust people who didn't wear their beliefs on their sleeves. He respected clarity and conviction, not silent observation. This man looked like he was gathering data, appraising the scene with a detachment that rubbed Riley the wrong way. Without a second thought, Riley stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his badge on his chest, a subconscious assertion of his authority as he approached the man. He ignored the thrumming sounds of the protest and focused solely on this stranger who looked so aloof, so composed amidst the cacophony. "You there," Riley called, his voice laced with barely concealed irritation. He gestured with a hand, beckoning the man forward. "What exactly are you doing here?" The man met his gaze, his expression unchanging, as he walked toward Riley. He had an unshakable confidence, the kind that Riley couldn't stand. There was no hesitation in his steps, no hint of fear or discomfort as he stopped just a few feet away, looking Riley squarely in the eye. "Officer," the man greeted him, his tone polite but restrained. "I'm observing." Riley's eyes narrowed further, his voice lowering as he spoke. "Observing, huh? This is a protest, not a show. Either you're with them, or you're not. So which is it?" The man regarded him with a steady gaze, his expression impassive. "I'm here to understand, officer. This is an important gathering for the community." There was something in the man's voice that triggered a surge of resentment in Riley. He felt as if this stranger, with his perfect suit and his serene expression, was challenging him, silently judging him. Riley took a step closer, feeling his muscles tense as he leaned into the man's personal space. "People like you think you can just walk into places you don't belong, act like you're above everyone else. But you're on our streets, and around here, you'll respect the law." The man looked down, taking in the polished shoes Riley had insulted, then looked back up, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Respect goes both ways, officer," he replied evenly. It was the way he said it, so calm, so unflinchingly confident, that set Riley off. Without a word, he spat on the ground beside the man's shoes, a small but deliberate act of disdain, as if trying to assert his authority in the pettiest way possible. "You shouldn't even be here," Riley muttered, his voice laced with contempt. "Go on. Leave before you get yourself into trouble." The man's expression didn't change. He offered Riley a measured look, the faintest hint of disappointment flashing across his face. He didn't retaliate, didn't respond with anger or indignation. Instead, he turned and walked away, his steps as calm and unhurried as ever, slipping back into the crowd with an air of indifference that made Riley's skin prickle. As Riley returned to his patrol car, he felt a smug sense of satisfaction, convinced he'd handled the situation with the right blend of firmness and authority. He prided himself on keeping the streets in order, making sure people knew their place. To him, that was the job, to enforce boundaries, to uphold the rules, and to make sure people understood the consequences of stepping out of line. As the day wore on, the memory of the man's expression lingered in his mind. That calm, unyielding gaze had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite shake. It was rare for Riley to question himself, but he found himself replaying the encounter, wondering why he had felt such an intense need to assert his authority over a stranger who had done nothing but look at him with a quiet confidence. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his small, cluttered kitchen, Riley tried to shrug off the lingering irritation. He'd handled plenty of situations like this before. Why was this one different? He grabbed a beer from the fridge, hoping the cold bitterness might drown the unfamiliar feeling gnawing at him. But the moment he took his first sip, his phone buzzed with a text from his precinct. Meeting with new Chief Turner tomorrow. Be in uniform and on time. Riley raised an eyebrow. He hadn't thought much about the new chief, expecting him to be another faceless authority figure with grand ideas, but little understanding of what police work was really like. But he would show up, give the new chief his due, and continue doing his job the way he always had. Unbeknownst to him, the man in a crisp black suit would be waiting at the precinct the next day, not as an observer but as his new leader. And Riley's world, so long confined to his rigid ideals and unyielding authority, was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The new chief's unmasking. The next morning, Riley walked into the precinct with a cocky stride, his badge gleaming on his chest and his uniform freshly pressed. He'd heard some rumors about the new chief, whispers that he was a reformist, a man focused on community relations. To Riley, reform was code for going soft, bending to appease public opinion rather than doing what needed to be done. A crowd of officers had already gathered in the precinct's main hall, the air filled with a mix of curiosity and hushed conversations. Riley joined the group, positioning himself in the back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. As the last of the officers settled into place, the precinct's lieutenant stepped forward to address them, his usually gruff expression softened with a hint of anticipation. "All right, everyone, listen up," he announced, raising a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Today we welcome a new era in leadership. Chief Elijah Turner has joined us, and he's got a few things to say. Please give him your attention." Riley raised an eyebrow. The lieutenant was usually the first to grumble about new leaders, yet here he was, speaking with respect, even admiration. Riley felt a pang of irritation as the lieutenant stepped aside, giving the podium over to a tall figure in a full uniform who walked out from the adjoining office. Riley's smug expression evaporated the moment he laid eyes on the new chief. It was him, the man from the protest, the man Riley had spat on and dismissed. The man in the crisp suit who had returned Riley's disdain with unflinching calm was now standing before the entire precinct, his uniform adorned with the unmistakable insignia of rank and authority. Riley's heart slammed against his chest. He felt rooted to the spot, as if his legs were lead. A cold sweat prickled at the back of his neck, and he resisted the urge to glance around, fearing that any hint of panic might betray him. He kept his face as neutral as he could, but inside, he felt exposed, stripped of the invisible armor he'd wrapped around himself for years. Chief Turner scanned the room, his eyes steady and unhurried. When his gaze passed over Riley, he lingered a moment too long, and Riley felt an uncomfortable pang of recognition. The chief knew who he was, and he knew what had happened the day before. For the first time in years, Riley felt like a child caught in a lie. "Thank you all for the warm welcome," Chief Turner began, his voice smooth and resonant. He didn't raise his voice, yet the room quieted, as if everyone was leaning in to listen. "I'm honored to be here, leading a team that has already shown dedication and courage. But I want to be transparent about my vision for this department and what I believe is necessary for us to move forward." The chief's words were careful, measured. There was no flash, no theatrics, and yet Riley found himself unable to look away. Chief Turner wasn't trying to command the room with sheer force of authority. He commanded it with presence, with something intangible that demanded attention without asking for it. "My background," Turner continued, "is rooted in community-focused policing. I believe in law enforcement that protects and serves every person in our city without exception. I believe that respect, fairness, and justice are principles we must embody, not just in words, but in action. And that begins with each one of us." A murmur rippled through the room, some officers shifting uncomfortably. Riley could feel the tension, the unspoken resentment of those who, like him, had spent years enforcing the law with a heavy hand and had little patience for lectures on respect and fairness. But Chief Turner didn't seem fazed. He let the murmurs fade, then continued with an unwavering calm. "As police officers," he said, "we hold authority in this community. But authority doesn't give us license to disrespect the people we serve. It demands from us a higher standard, a commitment to integrity, humility, and accountability." Riley's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as he heard the words. Accountability, humility, integrity. Each word felt like a hammer striking a nerve. His entire career had been built on control, on asserting authority, on making sure people understood who was in charge. Yet here was this man, someone Riley had insulted and dismissed, standing before him and his peers, challenging the very foundation of what Riley had believed about his role as an officer. The chief continued, "I won't pretend that this approach is easy. It requires us to look within, to face our biases, to confront the parts of ourselves that may be resistant to change. But that's the path I'm asking us to walk, and I believe that if we do so, we can rebuild the trust that has been fractured in our community." As he finished, the room was silent. Chief Turner's words lingered in the air, heavy with implications that none could ignore. Riley's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and shame, a prickling discomfort he couldn't shake. He'd never felt self-conscious about his methods before, never doubted that his approach was the right one. Yet now he found himself questioning it, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had allowed his need for control to eclipse the duty he was supposed to uphold. After a few moments, the chief opened the floor to questions, and officers began raising their hands, some asking about specific policies, others expressing skepticism about the new direction. Riley stayed silent, unwilling to draw attention to himself. He watched the chief handle each question with patience, engaging in thoughtful exchanges that somehow diffused the tension without diminishing his authority. When the meeting finally ended, Riley waited in the back, hoping to slip out without another word. But as he turned to leave, he heard the steady, unyielding voice of Chief Turner behind him. "Officer Riley," Turner called, his tone calm but firm. Riley froze, his heart thudding in his chest as he turned to face the chief. Turner's gaze was steady, his face unreadable as he approached, and Riley felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. He knew what was coming. This was the moment he dreaded, the confrontation he couldn't escape. The chief stopped just a few feet away, his expression neutral. "I wanted to introduce myself personally," he said, extending a hand. Riley hesitated, then took it, his grip stiff and awkward. The chief's handshake was firm, his grip unyielding. "Chief Turner," Riley mumbled, his voice barely steady. Turner nodded, releasing his hand. For a moment, they stood in silence, and Riley felt the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, the chief broke the silence, his tone gentle yet unwavering. "I remember our encounter yesterday, Officer Riley," he said quietly. "I understand that we all bring our own experiences and perspectives to this job. But I need you to know that respect is not optional. It's foundational. It's what allows us to do our job with honor, to build the trust we need to serve effectively." Riley swallowed, his throat dry as he fought to keep his composure. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but the chief's words left no room for excuses. He felt as if Turner could see right through him, as if every hidden prejudice, every moment of disrespect, was laid bare in the chief's gaze. "I'm not here to rehash the past, officer," Turner continued, his voice softening. "What matters is the future, the direction we're heading as a department. I hope you'll take some time to think about what that direction means for you." With that, the chief gave him a final nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Riley standing in the hallway, his thoughts a turbulent storm of shame, anger, and confusion. As he walked back to his desk, Riley felt as if a mirror had been held up to him, forcing him to confront a reflection he didn't recognize. His pride, once so solid, felt suddenly fragile, cracking under the weight of the chief's words. He'd spent years building walls, reinforcing boundaries, but in a single conversation, Chief Turner had dismantled them, leaving Riley exposed and uncertain. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at his paperwork, his mind replaying the chief's words on an endless loop. Respect is foundational. Accountability is not optional. Each word echoed in his mind, chipping away at the rigid beliefs he clung to for so long. The realization came slowly, reluctantly. He was part of the problem. His anger, his disdain, his need for control, they had clouded his judgment, leading him to treat people as obstacles rather than individuals, as problems to be solved rather than voices to be heard. For the first time in his career, Riley felt the weight of regret settle over him, heavy and unyielding. He thought of the countless people he'd dismissed, the faces that had looked at him with fear or resentment, the moments when he'd chosen authority over compassion. Each memory surfaced with a painful clarity, revealing the impact of his actions in a way he could no longer ignore. As the precinct buzzed with activity around him, Riley felt a deep sense of isolation, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of authority could fill. He knew he was at a crossroads, facing a choice he'd never anticipated. He could continue down the path he'd always walked, clinging to the power and control he'd relied on for so long, or he could confront the uncomfortable truth that Chief Turner had forced him to see. The decision weighed heavily on him, a chasm of doubt opening beneath his feet. He had spent years building his identity on a foundation of authority, but now that foundation felt hollow, built on a lie he could no longer ignore. With a heavy heart, Riley closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him as he grappled with the reality he'd spent so long denying. He knew that change wouldn't come easy, that it would require him to face parts of himself he kept buried. But for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, Chief Turner was right. And as he sat in the quiet solitude of the precinct, Riley felt a small, hesitant flicker of resolve take root within him, a fragile spark that hinted at a path forward, a path he wasn't yet ready to walk, but one he could no longer ignore. A mirror in the community days passed, but Riley's encounter with Chief Turner continued to haunt him, lingering like an unwelcome shadow. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of it, heavier than it had ever been before. It wasn't just the physical fabric, but the responsibility it symbolized, the authority he had wielded with such careless conviction. Now, as he moved through the precinct, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, some indifferent, some curious, and others perhaps sensing the inner conflict tearing him apart. Chief Turner's words had dug deep, embedding themselves into Riley's mind and stirring memories and emotions he long buried. Respect is foundational. Accountability is not optional. The phrases felt like wounds, raw and unhealed, reopening with every interaction, every call. For years, he'd seen his badge as a shield, a tool to keep people in line. But now he was beginning to see it differently. As a symbol, a promise he'd made to protect and serve, not just to control and command. As if sensing the turmoil within him, Chief Turner had assigned Riley to a new community initiative the following week, one aimed at building rapport with the residents of some of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. It was part of a larger plan Turner had for the department, a way to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community, to restore a trust that had been steadily eroding. And Riley had been selected to represent the department. He didn't know if it was meant as a challenge or an opportunity, but it felt like a test he couldn't ignore. The morning of the community meeting arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle, as if the city itself sensed Riley's inner conflict. The meeting was set to be held in a modest community center nestled between a row of aging apartment buildings and a small overgrown park. The building looked worn, its paint chipped and faded, the signage barely legible, but as Riley stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth within. People were gathering, chatting in hushed voices, their expressions a mixture of hope and skepticism. Riley moved through the small crowd, feeling like an outsider, hyper-aware of the badge on his chest and the uniform that marked him as an officer. He caught sight of familiar faces, people he'd encountered on patrols, though never in this way. To them, he was just another officer, one of many who patrolled their neighborhood, issuing warnings or citations, often more of a distant authority than an ally. He found a seat at the back, keeping to himself as he observed the room. Community leaders had set up tables along one side, displaying flyers, brochures, and small displays, highlighting local organizations, schools, and initiatives. A makeshift stage had been set up at the front, where a microphone and a row of chairs awaited the speakers of the day. A woman he recognized as one of the organizers, Mrs. Alvarez, was already speaking with a group of elderly residents, her gentle smile and patient manner easing the tension in the room. Just then, Riley noticed a young woman standing nearby, her gaze focused on him with a mix of curiosity and caution. She looked to be in her early 20s, dressed casually in a worn denim jacket and jeans, her curly hair tied back in a loose ponytail. When their eyes met, she held his gaze, unflinching, as if daring him to look away. Riley felt a flicker of recognition. It was Maya, a local teacher who'd spoken at protests before, a quiet but determined advocate for change. Taking a deep breath, Riley walked over to her, forcing himself to step out of his comfort zone. "Maya, right?" he asked, his voice as steady as he could manage. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Officer Riley, isn't it?" "Yeah," he replied, feeling the weight of her stare. "I just wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm here as part of the Community Liaison Program." Maya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "The program Chief Turner's been talking about." "That's right." He shifted, unsure how to continue. "I know it might seem like just another police initiative, but I'm here to listen, to understand what's going on here from your perspective." She raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "From what I've seen, Officer Riley, listening isn't something that's been a priority for your department." Riley felt a prick of defensiveness, but he forced himself to push it down. "I know that," he admitted, his voice soft. "And I know there's a lot of mistrust between us. But I want to try and change that, even if it's just a small step." Maya's gaze softened, just a fraction. "Words are easy, officer. It's actions that matter. If you're here to truly listen, then listen. These people have stories that need to be heard." With that, she turned and joined a group of residents, leaving Riley to ponder her words. "If you're here to truly listen, then listen." He repeated the words to himself, feeling a new sense of responsibility settle over him. Maybe for the first time, he wasn't here to control the conversation. He was here to understand it. The meeting began shortly afterward, with the local pastor, Reverend James, taking the stage to welcome everyone. His warm, soothing voice filled the room, setting a tone of openness and respect. "We're here today to share, to listen, and to find a way forward together," he said, glancing meaningfully at the officers seated around the room. "Today, we're not officers and civilians. We're neighbors." Riley felt a pang of unease, but he kept his focus on Reverend James, resisting the urge to let his defenses rise. This wasn't the time for pride. This was a time for honesty. The first to speak was Mr. Johnson, a frail, elderly man with a cane who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He approached the microphone with slow, deliberate steps, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. When he began to speak, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but the room fell silent, every ear attuned to his words. "I've lived here for more than 50 years, he began, his gaze distant as he recounted memories from his youth. "I remember when police officers would walk these streets, not just in patrol cars, but on foot. They knew our names, they knew our families. There was trust back then, a trust that's hard to find these days." He paused, his voice catching as he continued. "But things have changed. Now when I see an officer, I don't feel safe. I feel afraid. My grandson, he's only 16, but he already knows to keep his hands visible, to lower his gaze, to never talk back. He's learned that because of the fear he feels every time he sees a badge." Riley felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He had never thought about the fear his presence might inspire, had never considered the impact his attitude might have on a young person just trying to live their life. Mr. Johnson looked directly at Riley, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Officer Riley, you've been patrolling this neighborhood for years. Do you know my grandson's name?" Riley's mouth went dry, his heart sinking as he realized the truth. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know the names of half the people in this room, even though he had patrolled their streets for years. He had been so focused on authority, on maintaining order, that he had forgotten about connection, about understanding the people he was supposed to serve. "No, sir," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson nodded, a sad, knowing smile crossing his face. "That's what's missing. It's not about authority. It's about respect, about seeing us as human beings, not just numbers or problems." Riley felt his cheeks burn with shame, his defensiveness crumbling under the weight of Mr. Johnson's words. He wanted to apologize, to say something that could make up for the years he had spent ignoring the people he was supposed to protect. But he knew that words would be hollow. It was actions that mattered, just as Maya had said. The next speaker was LaToya, a young mother with a fierce gaze and a voice that trembled with barely restrained emotion. She held her son's hand tightly as she spoke, her tone filled with a quiet, simmering anger. "My son, Jamal, he's only 7, she began, her voice wavering as she looked at her boy, who clung to her side, his small face filled with confusion and fear. "He's already learned to be afraid of the police. He shouldn't have to feel that way. No child should." Her words hung in the air, a painful reminder of the damage that had been done, the trust that had been broken. Riley felt his heart clench as he looked at the boy, who avoided his gaze, his small hands gripping his mother's arm tightly. He was reminded of Chief Turner's words, of the responsibility that came with his badge, and for the first time, he felt the weight of that responsibility fully. As more residents came forward to share their stories, Riley listened in silence, absorbing each word, each memory, each moment of pain and fear. He heard about young men who had been stopped without cause, elderly residents who felt unwelcome in their own neighborhood, parents who had to teach their children how to interact with officers to avoid escalating a situation. Every story chipped away at his defenses, stripping him of the pride and certainty he had once worn like armor. He saw himself reflected in their words, in their pain, and it forced him to confront a truth he had spent years ignoring. He had become a symbol of fear, not protection. He had contributed to the very division he was now being asked to mend. By the time the meeting ended, Riley felt as if he had been through a battle, but not with the residents, with himself. He realized that his role in this community wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about rebuilding the trust he had helped to erode, about becoming the officer he had always thought he was, but had never truly been. As the room began to empty, Riley caught sight of Chief Turner standing by the door, watching him with a calm, knowing gaze. The chief nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle he had witnessed, and Riley felt a spark of resolve ignite within him. He didn't know if he was ready to change, if he was capable of becoming the officer the community needed, but he knew he had to try. Maya approached him as he made his way to the exit, her expression softened with a hint of understanding. "So, Officer Riley," she said, her tone gentler than before. "Did you listen?" Riley nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I did. And I think I have a lot to learn." Maya smiled, a small, hopeful smile that felt like a lifeline in the storm of doubt and guilt raging within him. "That's a start," she said quietly. "Sometimes that's all we need." As he left the community center and stepped into the rain-soaked streets, Riley felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet determination that had taken root amidst the turmoil. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. For the first time, he was ready to walk forward, not as a symbol of authority, but as a man willing to learn, to grow, and to finally become a part of the community he had spent so long overlooking. The weight of reflection. The weeks following the community meeting were unlike anything Riley had ever experienced. Each day, he found himself grappling with memories that stirred uncomfortably within him, moments he'd previously dismissed now resurfacing with an entirely new weight. He'd begun to see his life and his actions through the eyes of those he had affected, the people whose lives he had touched, often in ways he hadn't intended or even considered. Riley's patrol shifts became opportunities for introspection, each call a chance to put his newfound understanding to the test. But the shift from enforcement to engagement didn't come easily. Years of habit, of viewing himself as the enforcer, had built walls that didn't fall overnight. He could feel his old instincts fighting back every time he stepped out of his car, his training screaming at him to maintain control, to assert authority. But now, a softer voice echoed alongside it, reminding him of Chief Turner's words and the faces he'd seen at the community meeting. One evening, Riley found himself on a solo patrol in the northern part of the precinct, a quieter area with winding streets and tall, aging apartment buildings. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city, and Riley felt the familiar hum of the engine as he navigated the streets, his gaze lingering on the families he saw gathered on balconies and front steps. There was a peace to the neighborhood that he had rarely noticed before, a sense of community he had often dismissed as unimportant. He thought of Chief Turner and the words that had come to define his days recently: service over power, accountability over authority. They weren't just ideas. They were challenges, confrontations with a truth he could no longer deny. His mind drifted to his father, a man who had shaped much of his outlook on life and authority. Growing up, Riley had looked up to his father, idolized him even, despite the man's rigid worldview. His father had been a construction foreman, a man who believed in order, discipline, and control. He taught Riley to be strong, to hold his ground, to never let anyone take advantage of him. Riley could remember countless nights when his father would come home from work, tense and weary, his words filled with bitterness about how the world was changing, and not for the better. "You've got to be tough, Mark," his father would say, his voice low and stern, his gaze distant. "People out there, they'll try to walk all over you if you give them an inch. Don't ever let them see you as weak. Respect is earned, and it's earned through strength." Riley had taken those words to heart. They'd shaped his entire approach to life, to work, to people. He'd become a police officer not just to serve, but to gain the respect he had always craved, to command authority in a world that, to him, seemed chaotic and unstable. And in doing so, he'd embraced a rigid, unyielding version of himself, a version that had kept him safe, but had also blinded him to the world around him. Now, as he drove through the streets, he felt a sense of distance from that version of himself. He could see it clearly, like an old skin he'd shed, a version that felt foreign and uncomfortable. The past few weeks had cracked that image, exposing parts of himself he'd long buried, parts he hadn't even realized were there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in soft shadows, Riley's radio crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. Dispatch to Officer Riley. We have a call from Rosewood Community Center regarding a disturbance. Reports of teenagers gathering and causing a commotion. Please respond. Riley acknowledged the call, his heart sinking slightly. Rosewood Community Center. It was the same place where the recent community meeting had been held, where he had first confronted the reality of his actions and the impact they'd had on others. The thought of returning there, of facing those memories again, filled him with a mixture of dread and determination. When he arrived, he found a small group of teenagers gathered in the dim light near the entrance, their laughter and voices carrying through the evening air. They looked up as his patrol car pulled to a stop, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. Riley could see the tension in their postures, the way they glanced at each other, waiting to see how he would react. He stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to remind himself of Chief Turner's words. Approach each situation with humility. Listen before acting. He walked over, his hands resting at his sides, making an effort to appear approachable, not threatening. One of the teenagers, a tall boy with a sharp gaze and a wary expression, stepped forward, his chin lifted defiantly. "We're not doing anything wrong, officer," he said, his tone guarded. "We're just hanging out." Riley looked at the boy, feeling a pang of recognition. It was Andre, a young man who had spoken at the community meeting, challenging Riley with questions about trust and accountability. He remembered the boy's words, the raw honesty in his voice as he'd asked, "Do you really think people in the community will ever fully trust the police?" The question had stayed with Riley, gnawing at him, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that trust wasn't something that could be commanded or demanded. It had to be earned, through actions, through respect. Riley took a deep breath, meeting Andrew's gaze with as much sincerity as he could muster. "I know you're not doing anything wrong, Andrew," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I just wanted to check in, see if everything's okay." Andrew's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He looked at his friends, then back at Riley, his posture relaxing just a fraction. "Yeah, we're fine," he replied, his tone less defensive. "Just needed a place to hang out." Riley nodded, glancing at the community center, its faded walls and flickering lights casting a dim glow over the area. He could see the appeal of the place, a safe, familiar spot for these kids to gather, away from the pressures and dangers of the streets. "I get it," Riley said quietly, feeling the words come from a place of genuine understanding. "This place is yours as much as anyone else's. You're welcome here." He paused, glancing at the group, sensing the skepticism in their eyes. "Look, I know I haven't always approached things the right way," he admitted, his voice low, but clear. "But I'm trying to do better. I want you to know that you can come to me if you ever need anything. I'm here to help, not just to enforce." For a moment, there was silence. Riley could feel his heart pounding, the vulnerability of his words hanging in the air. He didn't know if they would believe him, didn't know if his words would make any difference, but he knew he had to try. Andrew looked at him, his expression softened, his gaze searching as if trying to gauge Riley's sincerity. After a few moments, he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we'll do that." The tension in the air eased, replaced by a sense of tentative understanding. Riley felt a surge of relief, a quiet satisfaction that he hadn't expected. This wasn't about control, wasn't about asserting authority. It was about connection, about building bridges he had once torn down. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Maya standing in the doorway of the community center, her expression unreadable. She had been watching the entire interaction, her gaze sharp and thoughtful. When their eyes met, she gave him a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a subtle endorsement. Riley returned to his patrol car, the engine humming to life as he pulled away. But as he drove through the darkened streets, he felt something different, something that lingered even as the night closed in around him. It was a feeling of purpose, of direction, a quiet determination that had begun to take root within him. Over the next few weeks, Riley's efforts to connect with the community deepened. He found himself attending neighborhood meetings, volunteering at local events, and even stopping by the community center on his days off to help with repairs and renovations. At first, the residents were cautious, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. But as the weeks went on, he began to see small signs of acceptance. A nod here, a wave there, the way people's faces softened when he passed by. One evening, as he was leaving the community center after helping to repaint one of the walls, he found himself approached by Latoya, the young mother he'd seen at the meeting, her son Jamal holding her hand tightly. "Officer Riley," she began, her voice tentative but sincere. I wanted to thank you for what you've been doing. It's not easy, and I know a lot of people still have doubts, but it means a lot. To me, to Jamal." Riley felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words settling over him with a quiet intensity. He looked down at Jamal, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes, his expression softened by a glimmer of trust. "Thank you," Riley replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." Latoya nodded, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all we need." As she and Jamal walked away, Riley felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a belief that he was finally, truly making a difference. He knew he still had a long way to go. That trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but he felt a sense of purpose that had once eluded him. The days turned into weeks, and Riley continued to work tirelessly, determined to become the officer Chief Turner had believed he could be. His interactions with the community deepened, each connection a small step toward healing, each conversation a reminder of the responsibility he carried. And as he looked around at the neighborhood he had once patrolled with a sense of detached authority, he realized that he was no longer just an officer. He was a part of this community, a trusted presence, a man who had learned, grown, and become someone people could rely on. For the first time in his career, Riley felt a sense of belonging, a belief that he was right where he was meant to be, doing the work he had been meant to do all along. The unspoken bridges. Months had passed since Riley began his journey toward redefining his role as a police officer, and each day felt like a new lesson in humility and growth. Every shift brought challenges that tested his commitment, but he remained steadfast, driven by a quiet determination to right the wrongs he had once ignored. The community, which had once viewed him with suspicion, was slowly beginning to embrace him, their guarded expressions softening over time, replaced with glimmers of cautious trust. One Saturday morning, Riley received a text message from Chief Turner. "Meet me at the precinct at 9 a.m. We have a special assignment, and I'd like you to be involved." The message was cryptic but clear, and Riley felt a mixture of curiosity and excitement as he read it. Chief Turner's influence had become an undeniable force in Riley's transformation, guiding him toward self-reflection and urging him to pursue his role with a new sense of empathy and accountability. He respected Turner deeply, not only as a superior, but as a mentor, a person who had shown him the path to a different kind of policing, one that focused on building bridges rather than burning them. When he arrived at the precinct, Riley found Chief Turner waiting in his office, going over a stack of documents and maps spread out across his desk. Turner looked up as Riley entered, a faint smile on his face as he motioned for him to sit. "Morning, Officer Riley," Turner greeted him, his tone as steady as ever. "Thank you for coming in on your day off. I have an initiative I'd like you to help with, something that requires a level of trust and respect you've earned from the community." Riley felt a flush of pride at Turner's words. "Of course, Chief. What's the assignment?" Turner leaned forward, tapping a map that showed the layout of a neighborhood Riley knew well, Oakwood Heights, a part of town that had a complicated relationship with law enforcement. It was an area plagued by a history of gang activity, low income, and strained community relations. Riley had patrolled those streets many times before, but always with a sense of detachment, as if he were only there to maintain order rather than truly engage with its residents. This area has been a hot spot for gang violence recently, Turner began, his expression serious. We've been working with community leaders to establish a peace initiative, something that gives the youth an alternative to gang involvement. But it's going to take more than just our presence to make this work. We need to show these young people that we're invested in their future, that we see them as individuals, not just as potential criminals. Riley nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. What do you need me to do? There's a community event happening tonight at Oakwood Park. Local leaders, volunteers, and teachers are setting up a youth mentorship program. They've asked for law enforcement to be involved, but they made it clear that they want officers who are there to support, not to control. I'd like you to attend, to be a part of it. You've earned the respect of people in this community, and I believe your presence could make a real difference. Riley felt a surge of anticipation mixed with nervousness. This was a rare opportunity, a chance to truly connect with the youth in a way he hadn't done before. It was a challenge, yes, but one he felt ready to accept. Of course, Chief. I'll be there, Riley replied, his voice steady. I won't let you down. Turner nodded, a flicker of approval in his gaze. I have no doubt you'll do well. Riley, just remember, these kids need to see you as someone who's on their side. Be yourself, show them that you care, and listen. That's all they need. As the day wore on, Riley found himself thinking about his assignment, replaying Turner's words in his mind. Be yourself, show them that you care. Listen. They were simple instructions, but he knew they carried a weight that went beyond mere words. This wasn't about following protocol or enforcing the law. It was about breaking down barriers, about showing these young people that someone believed in them. When evening came, Riley drove to Oakwood Park, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. The park was already bustling with activity. Tables had been set up with food. Local artists were displaying their work, and a small stage had been erected where a band was playing a lively tune. Families gathered, children laughed and played, and the air was filled with a sense of festivity, of community coming together in a way that felt rare and precious. Riley spotted familiar faces among the crowd. Maya, the young teacher he had first met months ago, was helping to organize games for the children, her warm smile and easy laugh making her a natural leader. Mr. Johnson, the elderly man from the community meeting, was seated on a bench, watching the children with a fond smile. And Latoya was there too, her young son Jamal clinging to her side as he watched the scene with wide, curious eyes. As Riley made his way through the crowd, he felt a mix of emotions, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years, but also a quiet responsibility, an awareness of the trust that had been placed in him. He wasn't just a police officer here. He was part of the community, a familiar face, someone people could approach without fear. He reached a booth where a group of teenagers had gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wariness as they noticed his uniform. Among them, he recognized Andrew, the young man he had spoken to before, the boy who had challenged him to prove that things could change. Andrew looked at him, his gaze cautious but not unfriendly. Hey, Officer Riley, he said, nodding in acknowledgement. Didn't expect to see you here. Riley returned the nod, a smile tugging at his lips. I wouldn't miss it. Chief Turner told me about the mentorship program, and I wanted to be a part of it. One of the other teenagers, a girl with a fierce gaze and an easy confidence, crossed her arms, looking Riley up and down. Why do you care about this anyway? You're a cop. This isn't exactly your scene. Riley took a deep breath, her question striking at the heart of everything he'd been working to change. I care because I know what it's like to feel like people don't see you, like they only see a label or a stereotype, he replied, his tone sincere. But you all are more than that. You're individuals, and you deserve respect, opportunities, and someone who's willing to listen. There was a pause as the teens exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Riley could see a glimmer of understanding, a tentative acceptance that gave him hope. "So, you're here to mentor us?" Andrew asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "If you'll let me," Riley replied with a grin. "I'm not here to tell you what to do or judge you. I'm here to help, however I can." They nodded, and Riley felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a quiet sense of validation that told him he was on the right path. As the evening wore on, Riley found himself immersed in conversations with the teens, learning about their hopes, their fears, and the challenges they faced in a world that often felt stacked against them. He listened as they spoke about their dreams of college, their love for sports, their passion for music and art. For the first time, he saw them not as potential troublemakers, but as young people with untapped potential, each with their own story, their own voice. At one point, Maya approached him, holding 2 cups of punch and offering one to him with a smile. "You're doing good, Officer Riley," she said, her tone soft. "The kids are opening up to you. They see that you're not just here to enforce rules. You're here to support them." Riley took the cup, nodding in gratitude. "Thank you, Maya. It means a lot, coming from you." She looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. "You've changed, Riley. I remember the first time we met. You were different, harder, closed off. But now, I think you're finally seeing these people for who they really are." Her words struck a chord in him, a recognition of the transformation he had undergone. He nodded, his voice quiet. "I think I'm finally seeing myself too. For a long time, I thought being an officer was about control, about authority. But now, it's about connection. It's about being a part of something bigger than myself." Maya smiled, her expression filled with understanding. "Welcome to the community, Riley. We're glad to have you." As the evening drew to a close, Riley felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He looked around at the people gathered, the families, the children, the teenagers, each of them a part of a tapestry he had once viewed with detachment, but now saw as his own. This was his community, and he was a part of it, not because of his badge or his authority, but because he had chosen to be, because he had earned it. Just as he was about to leave, Andrew approached him one last time, his expression serious. "Hey, Officer Riley," he said, glancing at the ground before meeting Riley's gaze. "I just wanted to say, thanks. For coming here, for listening. It means a lot." Riley felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of Andrew's words settling over him with a quiet intensity. "Thank you, Andrew. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you, all of you. You've got so much potential, and I'm here to support you however I can." Andrew nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "We'll hold you to that." As Riley walked back to his patrol car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that he was finally, truly making a difference. He wasn't just enforcing the law. He was building relationships, creating trust, and showing people that he was committed to change. In the past, he had seen his badge as a symbol of authority, a shield that separated him from the people he served. But now, he saw it as a bridge, a way to connect, to support, to protect in a way that was meaningful and genuine. And as he drove away from the park, the night stretching out before him, Riley knew that he was no longer just Officer Riley, the enforcer. He was Mark Riley, a part of the community, a man dedicated to service, respect, and the courage to build a better future. For the first time, he felt at peace with who he was and the journey he was on. And he knew that, no matter the challenges ahead, he would face them with an open heart, ready to listen, to learn, and to continue walking the path he had chosen. Redemption in action. In the weeks that followed the community event, Riley's connection to Oakwood Heights deepened. His days no longer felt like a series of patrols and routine encounters. Each shift was an opportunity to listen, to serve, and to be present in a way he'd never known was possible. The community began to accept him as one of their own. But more importantly, he found that he had become someone they could trust. It was a trust he treasured, and he protected it as fiercely as he once guarded his authority. The bond he was building, however, was tested one afternoon when the call came through. "Officer Riley, this is dispatch. We have a 10 to 54 possible armed confrontation reported at the corner of Oakwood and Marshall." The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. "Backup is on the way, but you're the closest unit. Proceed with caution." The streets of Oakwood Heights were no stranger to tension, but Riley knew this call was different. The address was near Andrew's apartment complex, a spot where neighborhood teens often gathered after school. A surge of dread settled in his stomach as he responded, 10 to 4, on my way. As Riley sped toward the scene, he thought of Andra, Maya, and the other faces that had come to define his purpose. The image of Andra flashed in his mind. The young man's tentative smile at the community event, the way he'd thanked Riley for listening. Riley had promised to be there for him, to protect and support. Now, as he approached Oakwood and Marshall, he prayed that he could make good on that promise. When he arrived, he found a crowd gathered, their faces tight with worry and fear. Several of the teens from the mentorship program were huddled together, their eyes wide as they watched two young men stand face to face in the center of the street, their postures tense and aggressive. One of them was Andrew. Riley's heart sank. Andrew's face was contorted with frustration and anger as he argued with another boy who looked just as determined, his hand twitching toward his waistband. Riley recognized the other boy too, a kid named Marcus who had been in and out of trouble, a young man known for his short fuse and rough demeanor. The crowd parted slightly as Riley approached, murmuring anxiously. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. They weren't just looking at him as an officer, they were looking at him as a member of their community, someone who understood the stakes in a way few others could. He took a deep breath, every instinct urging him to be cautious, to remember that this could escalate in an instant. But he remembered Chief Turner's words, the advice he had followed since beginning his journey. Listen. Show them you're here for them. Show them you care. As Riley stepped closer, Andrew turned and saw him. His expression wavered, a mix of relief and apprehension crossing his face. Marcus noticed too, his eyes narrowing as he clenched his fists, his posture growing even more defensive. Andrew. Marcus, Riley called, his voice calm and measured. What's going on here? Andrew looked down, clenching his fists at his sides. It's nothing, Officer Riley. Just a misunderstanding. But Riley could see it was more than that. The tension was palpable, the kind that didn't just go away with words. He could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile balance that hung between the two young men. One wrong move, one wrong word, and everything could spiral out of control. Riley raised his hands slightly, palms open, a gesture of peace and understanding. Andrew, I'm here for you, he said softly. You don't have to do this. Andrew's face softened, his gaze shifting to the ground. He took a deep breath, his posture relaxing just a fraction. Riley saw his opening and turned his attention to Marcus, whose expression was still hardened with anger. Marcus, Riley continued, his tone gentle but firm. You have a choice here. I know things are tough, that sometimes it feels like there's no other way to handle things, but I promise you, there's always another way. Marcus looked away, his jaw tight, his hand still hovering near his waistband. Riley could see the pain in his eyes, a pain he recognized, the anger of someone who felt unseen, unheard, pushed to the margins. I get it, Marcus, Riley said, his voice filled with sincerity. Sometimes it feels like people don't understand. But I'm here to listen. I'm not just an officer. I'm someone who cares about what happens to you, about your future. A murmur passed through the crowd, their collective tension easing slightly as they watched the scene unfold. Riley kept his focus on Marcus, his gaze unwavering, willing the young man to see the sincerity in his words. Slowly, Marcus's hand dropped from his waistband, his shoulders slumping as he exhaled a shaky breath. His gaze met Riley's, a flicker of vulnerability flashing in his eyes. Riley saw it, and he knew the moment was fragile, that any sudden movement could break the delicate trust they'd built. Riley took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "Let's talk, Marcus," he said quietly. "Let's figure this out together." After a moment's hesitation, Marcus nodded, the fight draining from his posture. He looked at Ander, his expression softening, a silent truce passing between them. The two young men shared a look, an unspoken understanding that spoke volumes. They weren't enemies. They were just two young men trying to navigate a world that often seems set against them. Riley breathed a sigh of relief as he gently guided Ander and Marcus away from the crowd, leading them to the side where they could talk in private. The crowd began to disperse, their faces marked with a mix of relief and admiration. Riley could hear murmurs of approval, quiet voices that spoke of gratitude and respect for the way he had handled the situation. As they moved to a quieter spot, Riley turned to the two young men, his expression serious but kind. "Look, I know things aren't easy. I know that sometimes it feels like the only way to be heard is to act out, to show strength. But real strength is knowing when to walk away. It's choosing a path that leads to something better." Ander nodded, his face flushed with a mix of shame and gratitude. "I'm sorry, Officer Riley. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus looked down, his hands in his pockets. "I'm tired, man. Tired of people thinking I'm nothing. That I'll never be more than what they expect of me." Riley's heart ached at Marcus's words. He saw himself in the young man's pain, the resentment that had once driven him to assert control, to prove himself in ways that had hurt others. He understood that feeling, that sense of being trapped by expectations, of wanting to escape the limitations placed upon him by others. "You're more than that, Marcus," Riley said softly. "You're more than what anyone else sees. You have the power to define who you are, to choose a different path, and I'm here to help you do that, if you'll let me." For a moment, there was silence. The words hung between them, filled with a promise that went beyond mere obligation. Riley wasn't just offering help, he was offering a lifeline, a chance for these young men to see themselves in a new light. Marcus looked at Riley, his expression softened, a flicker of hope breaking through the despair that had clouded his gaze. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I'd like that." Riley smiled, a sense of relief and pride filling him as he saw the change in both young men. He had done more than diffuse a situation. He had helped them see a different path, a path that didn't end in violence or regret. As the three of them walked back toward the neighborhood, Riley felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a belief that he was exactly where he was meant to be. This was what it meant to serve, to protect, not through authority, but through connection, through empathy, through seeing people for who they truly were. The experience with Ander and Marcus became a turning point, not only for Riley but for the entire community. Word of his actions spread, and over the following weeks, he noticed a shift in the way people looked at him. He was no longer just an officer patrolling the streets. He was a friend, a mentor, a man who had earned their trust through actions, not words. Riley began organizing more events in Oakwood Heights, working closely with Maya, Ander, and other community leaders to create programs that offered alternatives for the youth. They set up sports leagues, art workshops, job training sessions, anything that gave young people a sense of purpose, a place to belong. Chief Turner took notice of Riley's efforts, and one day he pulled him aside in his office, his expression filled with pride. "You've done good work, Riley," Turner said, his voice warm. "You've not only changed your approach, you've changed lives. That's what policing should be." Riley felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a sense of fulfillment he had never known. "Thank you, Chief. I owe it all to you, to the chance you gave me." Turner shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "No, Riley. You owe it to yourself. You chose this path. You chose to change, to grow. And that takes a kind of courage few people ever find. As Riley left Turner's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to continue walking the path he had chosen. He knew that there would still be challenges, that there would still be moments of doubt and resistance, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the strength, the support, and the courage to do so. Months later, at a community event, Riley found himself surrounded by familiar faces: Andrew, Maya, Mr. Johnson, Latoya, and even Marcus, who had started working as a volunteer at the community center. They laughed, shared stories, and celebrated the bonds they had built, the trust they had nurtured. As he looked around, Riley felt a profound sense of peace, a belief that he had finally found his place in the world. He was no longer just Officer Riley, the enforcer. He was Mark Riley, a man who had chosen to serve with compassion, respect, and an unwavering commitment to the people he called his own. And as he watched the community he had come to love, he knew that he had found his true purpose, not in power, but in service, not in control, but in connection. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be.